Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's so lovely to see folks in this room again. We're just getting back to in-person events, so thank you for coming. It's really exciting to be back in the same physical space as all of you and not some Zoom room somewhere. My name is Bonnie Adderstrom. I am the Assistant Events Director and a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight, it is our pleasure to host Ogi Ogas in conversation with Lisa Feldman Barrett to celebrate the release of his book, Journey of the Mind. Before I introduce our authors, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, please keep your masks on and your phones off or on silent. And thank you for doing your part to keep this event safe and pleasant for everyone. Secondly, copies of Lisa and Ogi's books are available for sale on the back counter there. I will be back there at the end of the event, so feel free to swing on by. We'll also have Ogi up front here to sign the books, so that will be very exciting. Also, please keep in mind this event is being recorded. We have live streaming set up right over there, so if you don't want to be on camera, avoid crossing in front of that space. And lastly, we will have a Q&A at the end of the event, so please hold your questions until the end, but definitely have them ready to go. All right, and now for the fun part. Our moderator, Lisa Feldman Barrett, is a University Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Northeastern. She received a National Institute of Health Directors Pioneer Award for her groundbreaking research on emotion in the brain, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Royal Society of Canada. Barrett is among the top 1% most cited scientists for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. She is the author of How Emotions Are Made and 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, both of which are available for sale in the back there. We actually had the pleasure of hosting Lisa for the release of 7.5 Lessons. And it was a really great event, so it's lovely to have you back. And our author tonight, Ogi Ogas, was a research fellow at the Harvard School of Education. He co-authored the books Dark Horse and Shrinks. He received doctoral training in computational neuroscience from Boston University, where he conducted research on mathematical models of learning, memory, and vision in the Center for Adaptive Systems. He is also known for his participation in game shows, including Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in 2006. That was my fun fact to discover. His book, This Is What It Sounds Like, What the Music You Love Says About You, co-authored with Dr. Susan Rogers, comes out in September. And of course, he is also the co-author of Journey of the Mind with Dr. Sai Gadam, which we are all here to hear him speak about tonight. A little bit about the book. In Journey of the Mind, the two neuroscience scientists trace a sweeping new vision of consciousness across 18 increasingly intelligent minds, from microbes to humankind and beyond. Why do minds exist? How did mud and stone develop into beings that can experience longing, regret, love, and compassion? Beings that are aware of their own experience. Until recently, science offered few answers to the existential questions. Journey of the Mind is the first book to offer a unified account of the mind that explains how consciousness, language, the self, and civilization emerged incrementally out of chaos. The journey begins 3 billion years ago with the emergence of the simplest possible mind, and then ascends through amoebas, worms, frogs, birds, monkeys, and AI, examining successively smarter ways of thinking. The book concludes by contemplating a higher state of consciousness already emerging, and the ultimate fate of all minds in the universe. So simple stuff. In a starred review, Kirk has called the book packed with insight and astonishing in scope. So we are really excited to have Ogi here to speak about it. Everyone, please welcome Ogi Ogas and Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is my first time really out in public myself since the pandemic began, and it's my first time ever talking in front of a group with a mask on, so I apologize. I'm sure it's going to be hard to see my facial expressions, but I can assure you I am smiling and joyful at all of your presence.
I think the mics are off. You can out on, yeah.
Testing. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about my book, and then why don't we just, maybe you can just ask me questions.
Yeah.
I don't think I was going to do a little reading, but she described the book so well that I think the reading might be a little bit redundant. But maybe I'll just give a brief description of how I view the book, and then Dr. Barrett can ask some questions, and then maybe you guys can ask some questions too.
Yeah.
So, why did I write this big book? The question that has consumed me my entire life is, what is the soul? Do we have a soul? What are our experiences made out of? Ultimately, what are we? Where did we come from? Where did I come from? And where are we going? These questions, since I was 18 years old, just consume me. It's been an obsession, a lifelong obsession. And fortunately, I got to live long enough that in the past few years, there's been a dramatic transformation in science's ability to answer these questions. Huge leaps forward that have not been communicated to the public yet, because a lot of these ideas are so technical, so hard to follow, they require a lot of advanced mathematics, that it hasn't really filtered down. Physics is always able to get their message out about their discoveries, but it hasn't really happened in the same way in the mind sciences. So I wrote this book to share some of these exciting new ideas and discoveries about how the mind works, which for me is how the soul works. And to explain this in a way that you don't need any science or mathematical background to understand. Something that's always bugged me about books about the mind, neuroscience, and the brain is they're always filled with technical jargon. You gotta learn about neurotransmitters and parts of the brain with big Latin terms. And I think so many of these books are focusing on the wrong things. What you want is to understand the deep questions. If you want to understand how consciousness works, how language works, how do we experience meaning and self-awareness, that to understand these things, it's possible to communicate how these work without getting into a lot of technical detail. So that was the challenge with this book. We tried to figure out what's the best way to explain these advanced forms of thinking, these magical forms of thinking like consciousness, language, and the self. And we figured the best way to tell this story is to show how these really complicated magical forms of thinking are built step by step. So by retracing the 3 billion year journey of the mind from the simplest minds on earth, which are the minds of archaea, wee little tiny creatures, microscopic creatures, all the way through the most advanced mind on earth, which is not an individual human being. By retracing each mind and showing, as with each new mind, what was the new mental innovation, what was the new adaptation in the mind that allowed it to become smarter. With each mind in the book, we review 17 different minds, we talk about what is the mental innovation that this mind came up with, and what was the challenge that that innovation solved. And with each new mind, there's a new innovation that solves a challenge, which introduces a new challenge, which requires a new innovation to solve. And so by proceeding in this incremental way, just focusing on the innovation that each new mind adds to the journey, we can see exactly the innovations that were necessary to produce first consciousness, then language, and then finally the human self, the personal self, the sense I am me, I am aware of me. And so the book is an attempt to explain consciousness, language, and the self by taking you on an adventure, and it is a fun, fun adventure.
Is it my turn now?
Yes.
Okay. I will say it is a really fun adventure, and my only piece.
Talk about consciousness in countries and cities at all is rather remarkable. We can even say too, an authoritarian country will never have the necessary dynamics for conscious. So Russia, for example, is definitely not conscious and cutting off their internet and filling themselves with fake news. It's just like a hallucinatory system. So a system like that just can't become conscious. If it was a brain, it would just be hallucinating and wouldn't do very well.
Lofty.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm not sure when we should. I have one more question I want
Oh,
to ask.
you were good.
before
I
we-
was just checking
Oh,
this.
okay,
So
good.
you
I actually have a lot of questions. So, you, in the book, you don't really name in fact, you only name one scientist by name.
Yes.
And you compare that scientist to Isaac Newton.
Yes.
That's a pretty big testimony right there. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about who this person is and why they have that stature in your view?
Yes, in our opinion, the greatest neuroscientist, the greatest scientist that you've never heard of is a man by the name of Stephen Grossberg at Boston University. And he has come up with a unified mathematical theory of the mind, and he has come up with a mathematical explanation of consciousness. So who is this guy, and why haven't you heard of him if he's so influential and important? Well, in the 1950s, in 1957, as a freshman at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, he figured out a new mathematical approach to the mind using a math called dynamic systems. So he viewed the mind as an activity back in 1957. And more specifically, he viewed the mind as a complex system, as an adaptive system. This was long before complexity was a formal notion in academia. And what's interesting is he figured out this mathematical approach to the mind about 65 years ago, and he has stuck with it for those past 65 years. He's been building out the math piece by piece by piece. And what he's achieved, the reason we compare him to Isaac Newton and the greatest scientists, James Maxwell, Albert Einstein, the greatest scientists all performed a unification, sometimes multiple unifications. The greatest scientists show that two phenomena or areas of study that seem different, that seemed apart, were actually one and the same. So Newton did the first and perhaps the greatest unification. He showed that the dynamics of objects in the heaven, planets and the moon and stars, follow the same laws as objects on Earth. So he showed the heavens and the earth can be unified in a single set of mathematics. Stephen Grossberg achieved a great unification because he showed that the magical forms of thought, like consciousness, language, and self-awareness, follow the same mathematical principles, the same mathematical framework as the most mundane forms of thinking, like wiggling our finger or kicking our knee or jerking our hand back if we touch something hot, or even the mental activity in bacteria or worms. That all of these follow the same set of mathematical principles. So Stephen Grossberg has performed a huge unification in the mind sciences, not widely known, not widely appreciated, and so we try to make that argument in the book.
So now I'm going to ask you though what my mother would probably call the shit disturber question, which is, but Newton invented calculus. Newton did amazing things, but ultimately, Newton's laws are true only conditionally. They depend on certain contextual things. So they're not true everywhere all the time. They're only true under certain conditions. They only work under certain conditions. So why did you pick? I'm wondering why you picked Newton as opposed to, say, Einstein or any number of people who, like Heisenberg,
Sure.
or any of the people who were involved in quantum.
Great question. So Newton achieved his unification by following a particular approach to understanding the world that was completely original to him at the time. It's now just the scientific method, but he threw out all ideas about gravity and objects and motion dynamics, and he just said, let's figure out how it works piece by piece. And so he just conducted experiments, tried different mathematical equations, did more experiments. He just went step by step, piece by piece, figured it all out on his own. And as she said, came up with his own math. He's like, okay, when gravity seems to be obeying these rules, so I need to come up with a math that matches these rules. There isn't a math yet, so I need to invent a new math. The same thing happened with Steve Grossberg. So there's a lot of mathematical frameworks that are often applied to the mind. Statistics is a big one. Computer science, some people say the mind is like an algorithm, mind is like a computer software. These are mathematical frameworks that were invented to study other stuff. Statistics was invented first to do astronomy, and then of course statistics is used in just about every branch of science. Computer sciences really grew out of logic and the philosophy of logic. These are great math, these are powerful forms of math, but they don't explain the mind. So what Steve Grossberg did is, I'm going to figure out the mathematics of the mind. And that's what he spent the past 65 years of doing. He came up with a mathematical understanding of the mind exactly like Newton did. Piece by piece, step by step, adding equations, seeing if the equation works, trying a new equation, just slowly building it out until finally he had a mathematical framework that covers just about everything.
So consciousness is probably one of the biggest topics that is, I mean, it's this mammoth kind of question. There are a lot of books about consciousness. It's one of the inside jokes that, scientists say to each other is that you have to be a certain age to write a book about consciousness. So people win Nobel Prizes in all kinds of things, physics, immunology, and then eventually when they get to a certain age, they all write books about consciousness. That's like the big thing everybody has an opinion about. So what makes this book distinct amongst the sea, really, of books about consciousness? And I just want to be clear. I think it's really brave that you wrote a book about. I avoid that question like the plague. I hate when people ask me about it because it's
Well, I think you hit a big piece of it right there when she mentioned that it's something that people have a career in science and then in their older age they turn to consciousness. You'll never ever solve consciousness this way. The problem is if you go straight at consciousness, you can't solve it because it's not really there. And this is why there's been such slow progress in understanding consciousness, because everybody treats it as a standalone problem. It's just like in Newton's time when people thought the planets, the heavenly objects, they have their own rules, and we'll figure out those rules. And yeah, there's boring rules down here on Earth that govern how rocks and stones and mud move around, but we're going to focus our attention on these heavenly objects. Just the wrong way to approach it. So most people that go after consciousness it's a standalone, narrow problem for them. What Stephen Grossberg did was he figured out everything else. He figured out the math for all the modules, for vision and perception and hearing and navigation and language and sequential learning and classical conditioning. He figured out the math for everything. And once he had math for everything, the math for consciousness fell out of it. He wasn't trying to figure out consciousness. He was trying to figure out the whole mind. And when he had math for the whole mind, the math for consciousness came out of it. And it's very clear. The math for consciousness is very easy to explain. Compare it to like making a pizza. Making a pizza is a lot of steps, but all the steps are easy. You cut the pepperoni, you sprinkle on the mozzarella, you make your dough, you roll the dough. Each individual step anybody can do. So to understand consciousness, there is a lot of steps. I can't summarize it in 10 words or less. But each individual piece, yeah, that's what I wrote the book for. But each individual piece that leads to consciousness is understandable, and that's what we tried to do in this book, is to give you all the pieces, and you're climbing a ladder, and once you have the pieces, hopefully you'll have a good sense of how consciousness actually works.
Did Steve know you were writing this book?
We communicated with him as we were doing it. He's not a very social
I was going to say,
person.
what did he? I was curious to learn how he felt about the being written about, and also being written about in the way that you write about him in this book.
Yes, he is understandably, he felt like he didn't get the attention he deserved. I agree that is the case, but sadly, it's made him, I think, a little bit bitter. So right now he's trying to get more attention for his work. He spent most of his career just in the lab doing the work. Yeah, he's a man that just is obsessed with the mind, I guess, as I am. Like, he is not a person that writes books. He just wrote now, I think he's 85 or 84. He's in his early to mid-80s, and he just finally wrote his first book.
It's huge.
It's huge, and it is dense, and it is impossible to read. I mean, I know the material.
It's like a textbook. I mean, it looks like a textbook.
Yes.
It's very big. It's
Yeah.
a very big book.
And it's not easy, and it's filled with difficult math, and I don't think he's going to.
So, but he must have been pretty chuffed, though, that you were writing about him and writing about his work in this way.
Yes, I wish he would be more excited by it, but
Uh-huh.
it's just a bit antisocial. I mean, it's good for us because he never deviated. I mean, all he's done his whole life. I think that's a piece of it too. I mean, if you're that insulated, he's just not. His social skills are not the greatest, sadly. But he is a genius.
Well, that sometimes is the way with geniuses, right? Or at least that's the idea.
Yeah, good for all of us that he's this way. 'Cause
So I'll just ask one more question,
Sure.
then we'll turn to the audience. So when I'm writing a book, I usually write about a bunch of topics, and some of the topics I feel very confident about, like I know, and then some of them I'm, more speculative about, and I usually try to flag that for people, like I'm speculating now based on what I know. So what's something in the book that that's more of a speculation, or that you're not unconfident about, but maybe less confident about, and that's still, this is your hunch or your intuition or where the data seem to be pointing us, even though we don't really maybe have enough evidence yet to be really confident.
Certainly the superminds and the fact that we contend that cities and countries can be conscious. We're confident about this, but we can't.
Like how would you test that a city was conscious?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? How would you test? I mean, how
Yeah.
can we test when anything is conscious?
Right.
The most straightforward way is, in the book we talk about, Stephen Grossberg has 3 laws of consciousness. I'll talk about these laws of consciousness and then maybe we can take some questions. So there's 3 laws of consciousness that fall out of this mathematics of the mind. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because these laws we can apply to countries. So we can apply these laws to countries to evaluate, okay, is this country conscious or not? So the first law is all conscious states are resonant states. Resonance is the key to consciousness. Resonance is a particular activity, a particular kind of activity that happens in our brain. There's many, many different parts of our brain where resonance can occur. There's not a single consciousness producing part of our brain. All throughout our cortex, anywhere where you can have two representations resonating with each other is an opportunity for consciousness. The second law of consciousness is that for a representation to become conscious, it must have features. So for example, I'm looking at this bottle of water, it's got a white cap and it's clear, and it's got kind of a cone shape. Those are all features. And there's places in our brain where resonance occurs, but there's no features. When there's resonance but no features, we aren't conscious of it. If resonance is occurring and the representation of features, we become consciously aware of those features. And the third law of consciousness just states that different resonating structures can resonate together. So if you have a sound resonating in one part of your brain, vision resonating in another part of the brain, like you're watching a movie, the sound and the images synchronize, and we're simultaneously conscious of multiple perceptions or multiple ideas at the same time because the different resonating parts of our brain resonate with each other. So by applying these 3 laws of consciousness, we can evaluate whether a city or a country is conscious. It needs to have representations, and we need to see those representations resonating. So we argue in the book that when the mass media puts out a story, in like a newspaper or on cable TV, that is an act of resonance. That's when the bottom-up input of a potential story is resonating with the editor or producer's idea of what the story is. And when that happens, you get a sustained transmission, a sustained resonance of that story. So right now, the invasion of Ukraine, that's resonating in the media consciousness. It's a really great metaphor because the actual physical dynamics of this really parallel the physical dynamics of resonance in our brain when we're conscious.
Or like a meme, right?
Yes, like a meme, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Maybe we should move to questions from the audience now. And did you wanna pick the questions or something? Yeah.
Why don't you?
Sure.
Folks,
Whoa.
use one of the other mics. Don't know what the deal with that is. Any yelling? No, I love that. No screaming microphone. All right, so I am going to come around with the mic as you feel free to call on folks, and I'll pass them the mic just so that we can hear what questions people have. So.
So I think you had your hand up first, there, and then there, and then there, and then there. Okay.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
Hi there.
So we didn't. This is. I'm not gonna lie. I just don't like it. So like this is. I'm 20 feet from this.
Yes.
There's a lot of theories about kind of the grand poobah of what the trajectory of intelligence leads to. There was an allusion here that the book eventually talks about kind of the crescendo of where this stuff goes. we're in a city full of people that have had those theories, right? The Kurzweils of the world, and the Future of Life Institutes right here with Tegmark. Where do you see that going in terms of your vision, and what thinkers kind of informed that perspective in addition to the Grossman fella, who you happen to like a lot?
So I mentioned in the Journey of Mind that there's these 4 stages of thinking, and what's fascinating is that each of the transitions between these stages follows consistent principles, and you can see it happening. That's why I was saying we can kind of see a new transition possibly happening around us right now. What this suggests, and the climax of the book talks about this, what this suggests is that there is an infinite ladder of mind and chaos interacting. It just climbs and climbs. There's no reason to think it will stop. So we suggest that the superminds might combine into hyperminds, and the hyperminds might combine across the galaxy with other intelligence to form ultraminds, and perhaps one day long hence there'll be just a few ultraminds contending for the entire cosmos. But based on thinking over the past 3 billion years, there's no reason to think that this will stop. There's no physical limit, because it's sort of a dance between purpose and chaos. It's a dance between, to each time the mind goes through this transition, is to increase its scope of purpose over reality. So, molecule minds and neuron minds went from, molecule minds have to deal with Brownian motion and the atomic tempest. They can't go straight. They're just constantly getting battered around. So they got bigger, but to get bigger, they needed bigger minds too. To get to module minds, they got bigger again. We, the superminds, we take the whole planet under our purview. Like, we think in terms of Newtonian time, because our minds are designed to think Newtonian time, but the supermind thinks in terms of relativity, that the GPS system, the fact that we have clocks all around the world that are all synchronized, that's supermind. Our supermind is conscious of relativity. We're not, but our supermind is. There's no reason to think that there's any limit to this. And perhaps it's even already happened. Perhaps there's already ultraminds and we're just the neurons. It's sort of like talking about a molecule or a neuron in our own brain. What's a neuron's perspective on the whole mind? Perhaps the ultramind out there just keeps having new minds like ours grow in different parts of the universe until we rise up and join. It would make a lot of sense, because one of the big lessons in the Journey of Mind is the importance of diversity and individuality. In each stage of mind, molecule minds, neuron minds, module minds, now our human supermind, diversity, the neurons diversify. We get many different kinds of neurons, many different kinds of molecular mechanisms. And with humans, you get many different kinds of humans. Diversity and individuality in humans, it's great. What this diversity does, it allows you to handle more of physical reality, expands the scope of physical reality. Because you need different sensors. You can think of us as just different kinds of sensors. We're looking at reality in a different way. We're contributing our take in reality to the supermind in a different way. But for this to keep going, you need to keep expanding with new levels. But again, what's the limit? There may not be one.
The person in the red.
Oh, yes. I was curious, actually, to kind of go off of that. When you talk about consciousness and like the things, the 4 ways to measure it, can you take that, you talked about cities and countries, can you take that to things that we think are not conscious, like animals or even like plants, or what is your
Sure.
opinion on?
Insects are not conscious. Insects are the smartest creatures on Earth that are not conscious. They don't have resonance in their minds. Fish were the first creatures to become conscious, and they're the least intelligent of the conscious mind. Fish do have resonance occurring in their minds. So resonance is the easiest test for consciousness. If there's no resonance, there can't be consciousness. So, yeah.
Although what I'm thinking of though, as you're saying this, is I'm reminded of the book by Peter Godfrey Smith called Metazoa, which is a great book actually. If you're interested in consciousness, it's a really great book. And he takes the view that consciousness isn't one thing, that there are features of consciousness, and please don't ask me what they are because I can't remember at this point, but there are a number of features. And so some animals can have one feature but not another feature of consciousness, right? So I don't think insects have any features of consciousness, but for example, some invertebrates have maybe 1 or 2 features but not all the features, and fish might have, which are vertebrates, may have other features but not all the features. So
No, I would strongly disagree with that. I mean, it's our take on it, our opinion,
Yeah, sure.
our approach. Consciousness is very specific activity, and we can define that activity mathematically. It's a specific kind of resonance. So if if you can't point to activity, I mean, I guess it's possible there's another form of activity that would be conscious, but it certainly wouldn't be found in lower minds. I mean, maybe we can construct some artificial way to create consciousness. The key to consciousness is designed for a specific purpose. So this is another reason people get so tripped up on consciousness, and I think Godfrey Smith suggests his approach sounds like this is a fallacy embedded in that, which is we think consciousness is just an emergent thing. If you've got a mind and a network, consciousness just happens. No, that's not the case at all. Consciousness was designed for a specific purpose, and here's the purpose: to manage attention in a module mind. When you've got a lot of modules, so we got a module processing what we're seeing, we got a module processing what we're hearing, what we're smelling, we're remembering the emotions. Maybe we had a fight with our significant other a few hours ago. Maybe we know we got to cook later, and that's on our mind. We got all these things bouncing around our mind. How do we know what to focus on? It's an attention problem, because each of these modules is doing its own thing all at the same time. So vision's doing its vision thing, hearing's doing its hearing thing. How do you manage this without a centralized decider? There's not some neuron or module in the brain that's in charge that says, okay, now you. These are all happening together. How do you manage it? Consciousness is designed to manage this attention problem. The way it works is, whenever resonance occurs in any of these modules, so like you're looking at something, I'm looking at this, the bottle's resonating in my brain. At the same time, I'm hearing my own voice here, that's resonating too. Whichever has the stronger resonance wins out. And this is why resonance is so important as a dynamic. It's like waves in a pond. So if you drop a rock in a pond, it creates ripples. So in our brain, there's always ripples going out from all these different modules, and whichever module has the strongest ripples, whichever module has the strongest resonance, takes over the entire mind. That's how it manages attention. So it's for a very specific purpose. That's why, ideas like maybe there's pieces of consciousness, but I would say that doesn't even make sense, because what would those pieces do? It's not like consciousness eventually harnessed these pieces. There would be no function. There would be no evolution wouldn't be able to act on this in, say, an invertebrate. I mean, there might be different forms of perception, but there would be no need or no utility to have consciousness.
Well, don't judge his book by my,
Right.
very.
I've read his other minds, which is quite excellent. So I'm
Yeah,
a fan
yeah.
of it. I haven't read that book.
Yeah, it's a very good book.
Thank you. Oh, hi. So I wanted to ask, I think that I generally understand the idea of resonance, but I was wondering if you can give like a concrete example of resonance in the human mind.
A good way to think about resonance is like two musical instruments playing at the same time, playing the same melody at the same time. So like a violin and a trumpet playing the same melody. And when this happens, the melody gets louder, and it also lasts longer. It gets amplified, and it gets prolonged. So that's the fundamental core of consciousness in the mind. You have two representations, a bottom-up representation, or perception, for example, the incoming perception of this bottle, and you have a top-down representation. That's our memory or our expectation. I expect to see a bottle. I know that she put out water here earlier, so I look at this, I'm expecting to see a bottle. They match, they resonate. This bottom-up input resonates with my top-down memory of a bottle, my top-down understanding of a bottle. And these two, it's like a violin and a trumpet playing the same melody. It prolongs it, it holds it in place, and it amplifies it, and the rest of the mind takes notice. If this resonance is important, let's say there was a leak in this, like that would immediately resonate more strongly and take over my mind, and all of the modules of my mind would now focus on this and dealing with this object in my hand. So you can think of it like musical instruments playing, and whichever pair of instruments is most in sync and playing the loudest takes over the music of the mind.
Earlier, you said when you were discussing neuron minds and molecule minds, that a neuron is a highly intelligent molecule mind.
Yes.
What does it mean? What definition of intelligence are you using to say that one neuron is highly intelligent?
If I was to be completely accurate, I would probably use the term autonomous rather than intelligence. In the journey of the mind, it's easy to separate intelligence, which is figuring out how to get a particular problem done, and autonomy, which is being able to freely make choices in any environment in which you find yourself. So the neuron is both intelligent and autonomous, but it's probably more accurate to talk about its autonomy. So just like a bacteria, an individual bacterium on its own can learn simple things about the world. It's not a very good learner. It doesn't have very good memory. It's got a very, very simple memory, very simple learning. But it can learn about the world. The longer it's been alive, the better it adapts to the world around it. And it's the same thing with a neuron. The longer a neuron's around, the more fine-tuned its judgments. Neurons are always growing and learning too. They're not just learning about a particular thing. Let's say there's a neuron in our visual system. Of course, it's learning about the objects it's exposed to, but it's also learning how to interact with other neurons better. It's also learning to reach out and form new connections. It's trying to develop itself in an autonomous way, just like an individual bacterium as well.
There
So-
actually really is some good evidence for that. I think that's emerging. It comes from surprising sources, though. For example, neurons are constantly exploring. They're constantly growing little nubs on their dendrites, just randomly. They're exploring for connections with other neurons. And it's only when those are reinforced, basically, that they stay. Otherwise, they die back. So neurons are just doing this kind of on their own, right? There's evidence, for example, that the dendrites, which are the branchy parts of neurons that take information from chemical information from other neurons, that they actually may have, like a single cell organism, that they may have an ability to integrate information that they're getting from multiple other neurons. That some of that integration is not happening in the cell body, it's actually happening in the branches themselves, which is also really interesting. So I think, and then there's this work by this physiologist whose name is Scott Turner. He wrote a book, he's written a couple of very interesting books, very, very controversial books. One of them is called The Tinkerer's Apprentice. Tinkerer's, something like that. The Tinkerer's Apprentice. Accomplice. The Tinkerer's Accomplice. And he argues that individual neurons are actually in competition with each other. Like the individual neurons in your brain are actually in competition with each other, and which sounds kind of preposterous, but then he goes on actually to give a fairly elegant demonstration of how that might be true. So I remember, I'll just tell you this one thing. I remember a number of years ago, I was sitting in we have this whole big research program with engineers and neuroscientists, psychologists, whatever. And I had just read these papers about individual bacteria being able to not just sense the world and act on it, but predict. That there's something inside the cell that allows it to predict, to have expectations and predict, to have memory basically inside a single cell organism. And I thought to myself, I wonder if individual neurons work this way, actually. If it's possible for, that you can see this in individual single cell organisms, like as small as a bacteria. Maybe this is how, maybe there's some level of this going on actually for individual neurons that we just don't really know about. And in part we don't know about it because we don't, until very, very recently, haven't been able to study neurons interacting with each other in live creatures.
There's also a conceptual obstacle. Like if you're viewing a neuron as just a little piece of something bigger, rather than recognizing how, a billion years went into the evolution of a neuron. Like it was a billion years of single-celled minds before the neuron. The neuron is a culmination of like a lot of intelligent autonomous.
Well, I think there's one other thing too, and I think you put your finger on it at the beginning, and I wrote it down, that a mind is not a thing, it's an activity. But the minute that you can start pointing to things, like a neuron, you forget that it's actually the activities,
That's right.
and I'm going to say activities in plural, that these cells are performing, in combination, in concert, with other bits and pieces in your brain, other types of cells, other types of chemicals, and so on. That's really where the action is. We look at a brain and we think, oh, that's a 3-pound blob of meat between somebody's ears, right, for a human brain, but it's tricky. It tricks us into thinking that the object,
Yeah.
as opposed to the activity which constitutes the object, is really where all the action is.
Yeah. It's hard to think that way.
It is very hard to think that way. So I think
Oh, go ahead.
we probably have more time for one more question.
Thank you. So earlier you were talking about how countries and states could become superminds, was it?
They are superminds. They could become conscious.
Could
Yes.
become conscious?
Yes.
And you were saying that an autonomous country like Russia wouldn't be because there's no free press or anything like that.
The dynamics inside of Russia don't match the necessary dynamics to have awareness.
Gotcha, thank you. And then you were also saying with free press there's all this like polarization. So like an election comes up and like so many of us are either like super to the right, super to the left, and there's so much disagreement. Is there any similarity between like this sort of like country and city consciousness to like our consciousness now? Is there modules that are
Yes.
disagreeing with each other, if that makes sense?
Yes. So I mean, this is exactly what's getting worked out. I mean, so the fact that there's polarization, Republicans and Democrats in America, at least, like, it's a good thing. This is how minds work. You have different modules or different parts of the mind that are doing different things, and they compete with each other. This is how every mind works, from bacteria all the way up to humans. The thing is, you need kind of a mechanism to manage that well. And in the past, the United States, the Constitution did a pretty good job, but we've got a lot more people. We're all wired together. Everybody's voice matters. It's a great thing. The truth is, what we're experiencing is a great thing. Everybody's voice matters, and we're hearing everybody's voice. And it's new. We're hearing people we've never heard from before. And every person, every country wants to get their voice out there. It's all great, but now we need system to manage that, and that's what's getting worked out right now. I mean, that's what we're seeing in social media. First, just everybody got on it. Now we're hearing everybody, and everybody's like, wait, I don't like you, I like you. It's all to the good. I don't envy the Silicon Valley companies that got to work this stuff out, but I think it's going to be we're all going to work it out together. I mean, the government will do some, we'll do some, Silicon Valley will do some, and hopefully they'll get worked out. I mean, it's hard to see the outcome, but these things, if you look at a 3 billion year history of the mind, it keeps self-organizing. I just think over time it's going to work itself out. There won't be some person, it's not going to be a genius that solved it. It's just going to be everybody just constantly interacting, and it's going to self-organize.
So does all that conflict lead to that like higher state of consciousness, or
It can. It's a potential. There's no guarantee. I mean, there might be nuclear war that comes out of Russia.
If you're interested in these kinds of things, you might have a look at the new book. I can't remember the two guys who wrote it. One is an anthropologist, the other is an archaeologist, called The Dawn of Everything. And it's it's a really fascinating book. Honestly, I'm on my second pass through it. And but what's interesting about it is that throughout the course of human history, the history of our species, there have been these competing, I don't want to call, maybe, they're not really motivations exactly, but they're purposes maybe, which is, one is to integrate with each other, and the other is to define ourselves against each other, off each other. And so they go through, they call it, I guess in anthropology it's called schismogenesis, which is don't ask me how people come up, so scientists come up with these names, right? But it means that you're defining yourself off of someone else. You are what they aren't, they are what you aren't. And you can see there's evidence of this in very old civilizations, even before, Mesopotamia. And what's interesting is that no one really understands when, why people in a culture, or even cultures, join together versus define themselves against one another. But when I was listening to this, I was thinking, this is America, actually. This is what's going on right now with polarization. There's, for some reason, or a set of reasons, because nothing really ever happens for one reason. It's all too complex for that. For some reason, people are now defining themselves off of one another, in opposition to one another, as opposed to by what they have in common. and maybe figuring that out.
Yeah.
You know, there are these two processes that are sort of in opposition, right? Maybe there's a sort of a larger lesson there. I don't know, but you might check out the book. 'Cause
What was the name of it
The
again?
Dawn of Everything.
Thank you.
I know he had.
Yeah, there's one more question.
My second recommendation, I would say almost anything by David Graeber.
I would agree. You know, I haven't read Death, but that's the next one on my
That's
list.
the one you have to read.
Yeah.
It's like one of the fundamental texts of like modern anthropology. It's a classic.
Yeah. Well, I'm very fortunate to have a brilliant scientist who's a postdoctoral fellow in my lab who, in our book, you know, we had this holiday party in my lab and we all bring a book and exchange books, and we both brought The Dawn of Everything, and he turned me on to Debt. So that's my next one. But did you have a question?
Yeah, actually. So I guess like over time during this conversation, I kind of noticed an interesting parallel with like the development of like this consciousness, kind of similar to Hegel's theory of like conscious development, of like kind of like the human like world spirit like worlds itself through like the resolving of various contradictions around itself, and therefore it passes like the more advanced stage of civilization. And if you read like the phenomenology of spirits, he kind of like posits at the very end that the outcome of this dialectical process, as he calls it, of like the resolving of contradictions would lead to like a total knowledge of like everything. Like when he termed it as thought thinking about itself. Like I guess like if you were to expand like your thesis about like superminds like super consciousness across like states and cities, like do you think that'd be like the final result to be similar to like what Hegel posited back in that book?
So like his idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis as being sort of like an endless source of ascension and building more structure and building more understanding. I think there is some of that in the journey of the mind. And I agree, like I said earlier, I think there's not any reason to think there'd be an end to it. You know, as long as there's some chaos out there, as long as there's some mindlessness out there, which there sure seems to be an infinite amount of chaos. But who knows? Who knows? Yeah.
But I think the reason why would be that chaos, meaning randomness or noise that is not predictable, is necessary in order for something to be information gaining, meaning you need to have that randomness there in order to have the opportunity to grow and learn and gain more information. If it's not there, you can't learn, actually, literally can't learn.
Your question about, you know, what's the ultimate outcome of it, you know, to know everything, that's a question about just the basic physical nature of the universe. You know, if there truly is an infinite amount of chaos, then there will be no end to mind's progress. I mean, if the universe is finite, if there's limits to it, which right now is an unsolved problem, then if there's a limit, then perhaps mind will eventually master all of it.
That's a great place to stop.
Thank you all for coming so much. Thank you.
So thank you to Lisa and Ogi. I'm going to be in the back over there if anyone is interested in getting a copy of the book, and then we'll have a little signing over here. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and we'll see you at the next event.